Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Steinberg, the Dean of SAIS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this extraordinary opportunity this morning for a conversation with Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the UNDP, the UN Development Program. Mr. Steiner became the Administrator of UNDP in 2017 and was confirmed after being nominated by the Secretary-General, and 2 years ago was nominated and confirmed for a second term as the Director of the UNDP. The UNDP, as most of you know, is really the key and lead agency for the UN system around development issues. And one of the important roles that he plays is the Vice Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which is the group that coordinates all of the work across all of the UN agencies across the full range of issues in dealing with the challenges of this sustainable development. Prior to joining the UNDP, something we very much appreciate here at SAIS, he was the director of the Oxford Martin School and professorial fellow at Balliol College at Oxford, thus giving him a very distinguished academic career as well as a practitioner's career, and something that, as I say, we respect very much here. And he's also had a very distinguished career throughout the UN system, including heading the UN Environmental Program, UNEP, from 2006 to 2016. He takes on this role following a very distinguished line of leaders in the international system who've held the role of the head of UNDP, including former Prime Minister Helen Clark, Kamal Darvish, a great academic, as well as a practitioner, Mark Malloch Brown, and many others, as I told him beforehand, including at an earlier stage, Brad Morse, who was my congressman when I was growing up in Massachusetts. We have this conversation today at a very important time because next week we'll see the convening of the annual spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which is a key moment for the leaders of the international economic system, both on the kind of broader macroeconomic side and on the development side, to get together and assess the state of the world and the challenges that we're facing. So it's particularly opportune to have a chance to talk with him today. And I want to begin with that. Achim Steiner took office just 2 years after the UN adopted these very ambitious sustainable development goals. And then shortly thereafter, the world began to face a series of shocks, which were certainly, I think, unanticipated at the time that the UN adopted the SDGs, and probably unanticipated for all of us. First, of course, the tremendous challenges by the broad-ranging impacts of COVID, which have had a particularly dramatic effect on the developing world, followed by the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, which again has had systemic impact on the international system with particular concerns for developing countries. And in the background, broader changes in the international economic system, including the challenges posed by the increased confrontations between the United States and China, which have significant impacts on the prospects for global growth, and which in many ways the developing countries are sort of caught in the crosshairs. So it's in the context of these deep challenges that the bank and fund are meeting. And I'd like to ask Administrator Steiner to begin with his perspective on where we are today. What are the issues that the bank and fund will be facing, and what does he see from his perspective as the hopeful outcomes of these meetings?
Well, Dean Steiner, first of all, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, also for referring to my predecessors, because I think the history of UNDP in many ways has also been shaped by the leaders that have led it over these decades. And much of where we find ourselves in today is also the story of development, really, of the second half of the 20th century and now the 21st century. And you begin by asking where do we find ourselves also in the context of this week's World Bank IMF meetings. And I think the simplest way to perhaps capture the moment is to use two words: disruption and uncertainty. I think these are the ways in which I would describe the moment in time in which we find ourselves, and also the World Bank and the IMF embedded in that larger drama that is playing itself out at the moment across the globe. Whether it is COVID, whether it is conflict and crisis, whether it is climate change, we are witnessing a moment in time where, as a development program, clearly we are looking at a world that is facing severe disruptions. It is highly challenged, particularly in the developing world, by the consequences, whether it is the long tail of the impacts of COVID, COVID-19, not only in terms of the health and human tragedies, but also in the social and economic impacts that continue to affect particularly developing countries right now in terms of fiscal space, in terms of debt. And we find ourselves in a moment where enormous transitions are essential because of climate change and are also being, in a sense, affected by developments that are happening in the broader geopolitical and geoeconomic arena. So a very tough time, and I think where I would begin by describing that disruption turning into uncertainty is that also the institutions that we built after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, precisely in order to deal with these kinds of shocks that have always been part of human history, these institutions are also struggling, both because of the geopolitical realities we face right now, which affect our ability to respond to the economic shocks that we are facing, witnessing the G20 at the moment, last year also, deeply divided and to a large extent also constrained in its ability to step up precisely to respond in these crises with very quick actions by the leading economies of the world. And the United Nations system. Many often focus on the Security Council, but that is, just a reflection of the political reality that we, have also faced before. Let us remember there was a Cold War, but also in terms of the United Nations system. And here the Secretary-General, I think you have seen him in the last few years, step up very much on the issues of crisis, of conflict, of climate change, and now also on the questions of international financial architecture and the response to the current crisis that many developing countries are now acutely facing, in addition to the many disruptions that we are seeing, obviously, in the United States with banks going under, in Switzerland, but also high interest, high inflation periods, all of this creating a very unhelpful context for countries that are still dealing with basic access to services, education, access to electricity, and now are highly constrained by the fact that they're not able to borrow anymore, and in fact are, in some instances, spending 20% of their government revenue just on servicing loans with interest rates. So let me stop here and perhaps allow you to drill a bit deeper, but that is the backdrop against which the meetings this week are happening.
A pretty daunting agenda that you just laid out here, and a great challenge both for you and for these institutions. So maybe we could drill down a little bit on the specific things. What could either or together the bank and fund do? I mean, these are broad changes. Many of these forces that you've talked about are out of the hands of the institutions, if not necessarily some of the leading countries in there. So as organizations, in the face of these really broad and consequential systematic things, what are the tools that are available to UN broad Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the bank to be able to address some of the things that you've talked about?
Well, I think what has been interesting over the last year is the fact that I think for the first time in a long time, there is not only the call from civil society organizations from developing countries that in a sense have called, for instance, in their representation of these international financial institutions for reforms. We have also seen countries such as the United States, for instance, with Janet Yellen, very much calling for World Bank reform. We have seen the World Bank's evolution roadmap emerging. There is clearly a sense that against the backdrop of what is happening in the global economy at large, but particularly also with a view to developing countries, there is a need for pivoting forward. And I think what we are beginning to see is, first of all, within the framework of existing regulatory and governance policies for the IMF and the World Bank, there are obviously things that can be done. A particular need right now is to inject liquidity into the international economy, particularly in developing countries. We also see the problem of debt having to be addressed. The common framework that was agreed during the pandemic has clearly only had limited success. So the question is, how do you address a mounting debt problem, where in UNDP's latest report, we estimate 51 countries being close to facing debt distress or one step away from debt distress and ultimately from defaulting. That's a very high number of countries. And again, the instruments in principle to increase lending and financing are available, and part of the discussions that have now been initiated and that will also be center stage at the World Bank IMF annual meet or the spring meetings now clearly are focusing on those short-term measures. And I think right now what we are seeing is that those would provide immediate relief, but not sufficient relief. There is a deeper agenda of reform that goes into the way that, for instance, balance sheets could be leveraged in the World Bank, a controversial debate because of the fear that leveraging balance sheets more could affect the AAA rating. But there are very different views on that, and I think it is important that during the meeting this week, the shareholders actually address these issues, because there clearly is a desperate need to address this issue of access to finance, particularly development finance. And we also need to address what sometimes is uncomfortable but needs to be put on the table right now, and that is debt rescheduling, debt restructuring. The current situation is an odd one, because in some ways, if you look at the 51 countries that we examine that are close to debt distress, they only represent 3 to 4% of sovereign debt, but they actually represent 40 to 50% of the world's poorest people across the developing world. So where financial markets might look at this as a manageable risk, to the reality in political and economic terms in many of these countries, these are potentially catastrophic scenarios. We have already seen what happened in Sri Lanka. We know that there are a number of countries that are very close to not being able to borrow anymore on the financial markets, and therefore with their fiscal space already completely maxed out due to the COVID pandemic and everything that had been done then, they're now faced with sometimes a spread between US Treasury bills and where they have to borrow of more than 10 points, 10% interest. That essentially takes you out of the financial markets in terms of being able to borrow. So debt rescheduling, debt restructuring is another critical part. And the third part is to also help countries in the developing world move from these high interest rate exposures to the more concessional lending that the World Bank and the IMF can do at rates that are far more manageable. And these 3 points, liquidity, debt rescheduling, debt restructuring, and long-term cost of borrowing, are the centerpieces of what the Secretary-General released a few weeks ago in his SDG stimulus plan. And I end by just making a reference to this, because in dealing with these short-term financial and economic shocks and the crisis on fiscal space, on debt, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we're actually in a decade of major transitions. The green transition, but also the addressing of poverty that is actually increasing again, food insecurity. All of these factors, we cannot treat them as two separate chambers in which international policy and financing take place, which is why António Guterres put forward an SDG stimulus plan precisely to link that short-term crisis response, in which the Bretton Woods institutions have a lead role to play, and the shareholders of these institutions, with the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, which remains really the only framework we have right now to have the world cooperate on these extraordinary pivoting steps that we have to take, climate change simply being the most dramatic of those.
It's a big agenda. And I guess one question, that just to stay on the debt aspect for 1 second here before going to the larger picture, is that, in the past, there have been a number of efforts over time to deal with highly indebted nations. And often the demand of the lender countries, the creditor countries, has been to couple this with reforms in the debtor countries and linkage between the offering of support for changes in governance and the like. Do you see that still on the agenda? And is it possible to reach an agreement that would be satisfying both to the lender countries and the developing countries to deal with these very highly focused problems of heavy indebtedness?
Well, it's difficult to answer this in a sort of general sense. Every country obviously has different track records in terms of public policy, fiscal policy, and development policies. But let me perhaps take one step back and say that for many developing countries, looking at the reality that they face right now, I think we should be a little bit more empathetic, because much of what they are facing right now, the shocks that they're going through, really have not been caused through domestic policy actions principally. COVID-19, no developing country really could be blamed for having encountered this extraordinary challenge of keeping going through the pandemic. Secondly, the debt crisis, I always say it takes two to have a debt crisis, those who lend and those who borrow. And we have gone through a period of very low interest rates. Essentially, developing countries were encouraged to borrow, both in terms of sovereign borrowing, but also private sector lending has reached unprecedented levels. We often forget that the difference between today and perhaps 20 years ago is that the majority of debt that is incurred by developing countries today is actually private sector held debt or creditors from the private sector. So this has also complicated the picture, which is why during the past 18 months, the G20 has been struggling to find a way forward, because while they were obviously in a position to deal with sovereign debt, and during the pandemic set up, the comprehensive framework and debt suspension, private creditors have really not come to the table. And that has only changed in the last couple of months, because private creditors are now beginning to see some of their distressed debt trading at 40 to 60 cents to the dollar, which means they have a much more acute interest in coming to the table to renegotiate also the current debt management strategy, including debt rescheduling and debt restructuring. So we're back into territory where, the HIPIC kind of approach and also the Brady bond. These are two tools that some of you will be familiar with from the way we've dealt with these excessive debt levels in the past, become very much attractive instruments, because at the end of the day, what we're dealing with right now is a period of global disruption and increasing nervousness in the financial markets. And we have just seen, whether it was with the Silicon Valley Bank, whether it was with Credit Suisse, it doesn't take much to make financial markets move into very nervous territory. And those 51 countries I mentioned may be in material terms marginal to the current perception of global financial stability. But we also have to recognize that political and economic instability very quickly can affect markets in ways that have nothing to do with how shares are traded. And this is why the ability to step forward with instruments right now that address this issue in terms of a global economic pathway towards greater stability is so important. Another factor that I want to mention is that even when it comes to climate change, we are still in a situation where we are negotiating each year more ambitious targets. We are asking developing countries to step up higher and faster in terms of emission reduction. And yet $100 billion commitment made over a decade ago to co-finance and co-invest in developing countries' ability to move faster by the richer world has still not been fulfilled. We often have the perception that developing countries aren't doing anything, and this is also a tragic error, and this in part poisons the climate for international negotiations in the climate change negotiations. We often overlook that hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent by developing countries in transition towards cleaner energy matrices and infrastructure. They are actually investing enormously in moving forward, and we can come back to that a little bit later. And yet again, they feel as if they've not really had the other half of the bargain being upheld. So it is a moment in which the richer world has to rethink the way in which it views global economic stability, but also the broader development pathways for a global economy. And just to give you a sense of how it must feel sometimes to developing countries to be told there is no money. We see donor fatigue and many arguments about why countries cannot afford to invest more than the current 170 billion a year roughly in ODA. Just Silicon Valley Bank, the United States mobilized $400 billion in order to deal with the rescue of this bank. This is more than the total amount of finance that actually reached developing countries since 2020. So let us, in a sense, recognize that there are different viewpoints and different perspectives to this crisis. But if you want to solve it together, one of the critical things, and this is where the World Bank and the IMF are the world's principal platforms for negotiating and for cooperating in dealing with these crises, increasing their ability to lend and to inject liquidity into developing economies becomes a crucial trigger factor to being able to contain this crisis, mitigate its impacts, and ultimately be able to invest out of this crisis again.
You mentioned, in addition to the bank and fund, the role of the G20. And of course, the great challenge at the moment of the G20 is the geopolitics, with the obvious problem of the presence of Russia, but also the challenges and the difficulties between the United States and China. As you watch this, I mean, do you think on these issues that the G20 can set aside these broader political differences to come up to deal with issues around debt and development?
Well, it has proven very difficult, and I think the Indonesian G20 presidency of the year 2022, I think, was a reflection of this very deep rift that now characterizes these discussions. I represent the United Nations system in the finance ministers, central bank governors track, and I can tell you the atmosphere is sometimes extremely tense. the ability to reach decisions by consensus, which has always been the basis for the G20 to operate, has obviously been largely elusive. And I think Indonesia, first of all, deserves enormous credit in 2022 from having prevented, in a sense, these crises destroying the G20, which is a vital platform for dealing, particularly in crisis moments, with the kinds of responses we need. I am observing with great admiration India's G20 presidency at the moment. I think India has invested enormous amounts of its political capital, its convening power. There are literally dozens of meetings that are happening through different tracks in the G20 to try and find not only common ground, but also the ability to be able to retain that capacity to act. And I think the first two meetings of the foreign ministers and of the finance ministers clearly did not end where India had hoped it could, because a communique could not be adopted. But let us be very clear. In the finance ministers, central bank governors track, actually a lot of work happened, and it was only on the 2 or 3 paragraphs related to the Ukraine and Russia that no agreement could be found. Therefore, no communique was issued. The other 17 or 18 paragraphs were in fact agreed, and in a sense represent a blueprint for how the G20 presidency with India can continue to build on bringing the G20 back to the center stage of at least the short-term responses. So I think, let's be very clear, the political reality does not bypass the G20. So clearly the G20 is also a reflection of these political tensions right now. But, you know, even in the worst of times, we sometimes have to find the strength in our multilateral platforms, but also in the G20, to act in the interests of the collective good. And that despite the differences that exist. So I hope that India will continue with its very active diplomacy right now to be able to create the space where the G20 retains its ability to act. It's fundamental to dealing with the crisis right now, but it's also an incubator for some of the reforms, including the longer term international financial architecture reforms that are now very much on the table. And Janet Yellen, I mentioned her at the beginning, being one of the very active proponents of this.
I want to thank the many, many people who've joined this webinar. I see over 150 participants, which is great. And well, I'm going to ask a couple more questions to Administrator Steiner. I welcome questions from those of you who are participating remotely. If you could put your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar, and I will try to monitor that as we continue our discussions. But we're really eager to hear from you and take advantage of the opportunity to put your questions to Administrator Steiner. So we talked. You've talked a lot about the issues around climate, and I want to get your reaction. We've just had the latest report from the IPCC, which shows that there has been some progress, but that in terms of the ambitions and the real needs, that the challenges remain very dramatic. I wonder if you could reflect on what lessons we should take away from the new IPCC report, and following both Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, what you see as the priorities going forward at this point.
Thank you, Dean, and a critical question, obviously, at this moment. I think the IPCC report, in many ways, on the one hand, summarizes where the science is becoming ever more clear and provides us with ever clearer scenarios as to what the cost of inaction is. I use that term deliberately because I want to go back to Lord Nicholas Stern and, you know, almost 2 decades ago, already being able to show the world that the cost of not acting on climate change will far exceed all these arguments that we have heard so many times about why we cannot act faster, why we cannot afford to act, why renewable energy technologies are not sufficiently robust for our energy systems. I think all of this, the IPCC report put into a very clear perspective right now. We are on the verge of having passed the point where a 1.5 degree world, meaning limiting global warming to that, is almost becoming impossible. It also documents essentially serial failures in acting on opportunities to avert that scenario. And I think above all, the IPCC still, and this was to me a little surprising to many others, retains, let's say, its view that it is doable. And in some ways, I have to say on reflection, I believe they're absolutely right. Because if you take, for instance, climate change in terms of the Climate Change Convention, the Paris Agreement, but also SDG 13 on climate change, few would have predicted the kinds of investments and the kinds of increases in installed capacity of renewable energy infrastructure that we are now beginning to see in the world. Ironically, it takes a war and an energy crisis to finally demonstrate what many have argued for a long time, that energy security in the 21st century is not only premised on the economics and the amount of megawatts of installed capacity, is also the continued and uninterrupted access to energy supplies. And as we move virtually everywhere in the world now towards increasingly an electricity-based economy, whether it's for buildings, for industry, for mobility, clearly the ability to generate electricity in a certain and predictable way has fundamentally changed also the framework within which countries are looking at renewables. So energy security has now catapulted, I think, the investments we will see already now visible through the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal, but not only in Europe and North America. In fact, in China, in India, we see extraordinary investments taking place in the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure, often overlooked by the world because, yes, they are also some of the largest emitters at the moment of CO2 emissions. But if you look at the volume of investments, take India, 480,000 megawatts of installed renewable energy infrastructure by the year 2030. That's an extraordinary investment that India is undertaking. And with very little or no real support from the international community, most of it is financed in India through private sector investment. These are extraordinary steps that we are seeing. And so against the backdrop of an increasingly disturbing scenario of not acting, we are seeing also the pathways of how to move forward, how to pivot forward, and with greater ambition. So I would, in a sense, still hold on to this idea that maybe by 2030, we will have seen that energy revolution that has already begun in many parts of the world, actually reaching a point where it may still be compatible with a 1.5 degree scenario, but not, and this is extremely important to emphasize, not if the wealthier part of the world is not able and willing to co-invest in this. It is, in today's world, largely a question of development finance, of investment capital, that is the real constraint to a massive expansion in clean energy infrastructure in the world. And just to give you two more examples, this is not just China and India. I often quote in recent times examples that I find extremely heartening. A country like Uruguay is today producing close to 95% of its electricity with renewable energy infrastructure. A country like Kenya is above 90% in producing its electricity supplies with clean energy infrastructure. These countries have demonstrated that with the support and the co-investment, but also with very bold domestic policy, you're actually able to make these transitions. These energy transitions become a centerpiece of addressing climate change in today's world. In addition to what we are seeing, obviously, in many of the national strategies on climate change related to energy efficiency in buildings, mobility, the transition towards electric or EV transport platforms, these are the great accelerators, not only of a transition towards a net zero world, but also for economic growth, which is in fact, again, Lord Nicholas Stern's argument for the last 10 years. The great growth story of the 21st century will be climate change in the way we respond to it.
You mentioned the impact of the Ukraine crisis and sort of focusing our attention on energy security, but some have been concerned that this has kind of been the rejuvenation of gas, as it were, that at least in the near term, the impact has been as much to strengthen the appeal and redevelop the infrastructure around natural gas as a source of energy. How serious a problem is this, and how much of a disruption to this transition do you think this represents?
Well, if you go on past record, then frankly, the enormous profits that are now being generated in the oil and gas sector clearly are a warning sign that we may find ourselves being held hostage yet again to investments that will lock us in to essentially a oil and gas infrastructure and exploration economy that will argue that, we have made these extraordinary investments for energy security. We cannot exit them for the next 20 to 30 years. So let's be very frank. This is a moment where public policy and public interest have to take center stage. Oil and gas companies are doing the job that they set out to do. And as long as markets and the regulatory framework rewards them for doing it, please don't be surprised if they will continue to do what they do. And obviously, with enormous returns, not least as a result of the crisis we face right now. But there are countries, and I've mentioned some of them already, Denmark, Germany being other countries in Europe, for instance, in the industrialized world, that have taken very deliberate decisions on transition towards clean energy infrastructure. Denmark is heading for 70% clean energy right now. Germany is probably going to bypass or pass the 50% point of renewable energy electricity supply later this year. These are major economies that have demonstrated that with the right regulatory framework, the right incentives, you can actually create an energy economy for tomorrow, today. It's possible, but not if you simply allow the markets to continue to operate in a way where essentially making a lot of money in the present generation is entirely at the expense of the next generation. So the amount of capital that is currently on the books and in the banks of the oil and gas industry, and particularly the gas sector, clearly could still become a major brake on these transitions. If, however, we can leverage these enormous potential investments into a clean energy infrastructure, then in fact the oil and gas sector could become an investor in this. I think it will be interesting to see whether, for instance, the United Arab Emirates and the host of COP28 this year can put this discussion really in the center of how the energy sector actually intends to respond to this current setup. The fact of the matter is we can afford to make these transitions, but we need investments. If the current energy economy around oil and gas, and coal has already proven that in a sense a phase out can happen over a number of years without causing major economic disruption, if that oil and gas sector is able to be incentivized, and to some extent with regulatory measures, we also correct for the distorted pricing where the costs of fossil fuel accrue to the taxpayer, the profits to the companies, and in the renewable energy sector, the opposite is the case. If that continues, then indeed we are going to miss the 2030 point.
We have a question from Arthur Appleton, which anticipated a question I was going to ask you, so thinking along the same lines, about whether you think efforts like the EU's cross-border adjustment mechanism, the idea of putting tariffs on carbon-intensive products, will have a detrimental effect on developing countries, and where do you see tools like the CBAM fitting into an energy strategy, a clean energy strategy?
Well, I think even the Europeans would say that the kind of border adjustment tariff that they're envisaging right now, and I think it is likely to come. I mean, that seems to be the indication out of Brussels and the European Parliament, is not something that people strive for as desirable, but it will become, in the minds of many, at the end of the day, inevitable. And in that sense, yes, it could disrupt. The question is whether, in the instance of Europe, for example, establishing such a regime, it at the same time also mobilizes additional investment to co-invest in developing countries being able to accelerate their transition towards a net zero energy infrastructure. Only putting on barriers to trade, but not increasing the investment, particularly for least developed countries that are obviously not in a position to mobilize the kind of investments that are needed right now to transition towards a cleaner energy infrastructure, would indeed put many developing countries in a more risky territory. So as a global economic instrument, and also to protect European industry and European consumers who are going to pay more in order to have clean energy infrastructure, is obviously something that is very much at the heart of this debate right now. But we do live in a global economy, and despite many saying globalization maybe has peaked, I don't think that really is a scenario for the 21st century in the future. But it will shift many of the fundamentals that have, let's say, shaped the trading regime over the last 20 to 30 years. Interestingly, climate change, I think, will be a fundamental correction factor in the way that global trade will continue to evolve. Now, from a developing country perspective, and particularly UNDP, is very much invested in helping developing countries become sovereign actors in this very disruptive period. We are putting a lot of our focus right now on helping developing countries to put in place the regulatory framework, to de-risk the investment environment, and to allow them to massively increase access to renewable energy infrastructure. Right now, we have a mini-grids program for 21 African countries that is funded by the GEF and will also leverage significant amount of private sector financing and investment that could connect 265 million citizens on the African continent to renewable energy infrastructure in the next 5 to 7 years. It is these kinds of combined measures that I think will allow this rapid transition that will come on the one hand from being protective of one's own industry and economy, but also cognizant of the need for developing countries to be, let's say, players in this new energy economy that can be considered a fair playground. These are, I think, the determinants that will either turn such a measure into a punitive measure from the perspective of developing countries or into an acceleration measure for both sides to move faster.
We've got another question from our participants, again, focusing on kind of strategies to deal with the climate problem, and particularly what role you see market mechanisms like carbon credits or the old clean development mechanism playing as a part of the overall strategy.
I think it's the efficacy of these different instruments that should determine their deployment. I'm very agnostic, personally speaking, as to which measures a country adopts or which measures are put in place. Clearly, we all know that markets can be very efficient, very effective, and very fast, but they can also be the great brakes on transition. So markets without appropriate regulatory frameworks, without appropriate incentives that allow them to pivot towards a different energy pathway, will not deliver for us the kind of transition we need. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the year 2023 where we are. The science, the knowledge, the opportunity, the technology, even the economics have already been in place, and yet we still see a world much more likely to invest in new fossil fuel developments right now than in massively expanding renewable energy infrastructure in some countries. So I think market mechanisms, including carbon credits, but also concessional finance, more incentives for co-investment, de-risking also through investment guarantees, first loss instruments, and so on. These are the mechanisms that I think will drive a market for energy and a market for energy technologies that is compatible with where the IPCC essentially has held up the report card just a few days ago.
I want to come back to your role as sort of one of the czars of sustainable development and the SDGs within the UN system, and an issue that I've thought a lot about in my own work and teaching. So the big change, or one of the big changes as the UN and the UN system moved from the Millennium Development Goals to the SDGs was a much more broad and comprehensive framework within which to think about development strategy. But some critics have said it is that by having this, on the one hand, very sophisticated and broad-based set of goals, but a very large number and complex ones, that it's been harder to get a focus on getting achievements. And particularly in light of the challenges that have emerged in the COVID and post-COVID world, how do we keep the focus that was one of the strengths of the MDGs to drive the process to deal with this much more sophisticated but complex framework of the SDGs?
Well, if you allow me, Dean Steinberg, let me turn the logic on its head. We live in a much more complex world, and therefore the SDGs are in many ways a product of a very simple reality. Life is complex. Living with 8 billion people on this planet, being able to achieve a kind of poverty reduction strategy on the one hand, achieving wealth creation, developing the jobs of tomorrow, the markets for tomorrow, simply are not best addressed anymore by having silver bullets. We've gone through many decades of poverty reduction, basic needs, the early tenets of technical cooperation, development cooperation, even UNDP being born in 1965 out of this notion that if we help people to basically learn how to do certain things, then development takes off. We live in a highly interdependent global economy. We live in a highly unequal global economy, and we now live in a global reality where the actions of one part of the world, usually the wealthiest and the smallest in terms of the relative share of population, are fundamentally affecting the development possibilities of the vast majority of the world. So in any way in which one wants to tackle this, and I think the development narrative and the development prism is actually an extremely relevant one, but it needs to pivot forward. Much of what I've tried to bring during my tenure in UNDP is a forward and future-looking development agenda. If we continue to simply try to look in the back mirror and see what we have not yet achieved, we are missing enormous opportunities of where developing countries, first of all, need to very rapidly adapt to extraordinary changes that are happening. Technology being one of them. We've talked about energy technology, but let's also touch maybe briefly on digital. This is probably the single most important transformative variable for how developing countries will be able to move forward faster to address both basic needs of their populations, but also ready their economies for an extraordinarily technologically and data-dependent global economy in the future. These are the investments. This is the kind of development agenda that requires us to address not single policies or silver bullet strategies. It is actually about addressing the complexity of sustainable development, because we live in an age where, developing your economy, then worrying about inequality later, and then dealing with lack of sustainability even later is no longer an option. We have to do all three. And that is why I think the SDGs are in some ways an extremely smart way of capturing complexity on the one hand, the necessity for integrated approaches, and thirdly, to recognize also what Ban Ki-moon called the SDGs in 2015, a declaration of interdependence. We are now dependent as sovereign nations on the actions of other sovereign nations in terms of our own future development pathways. And that is an extraordinarily powerful thought to hold on to. Let me also address the fact that, as you know, we have an SDG summit in September this year during the UN General Assembly week. And clearly, it does not take much imagination to appreciate that many of the indicators and targets that we set out in 2015 are not on track. On the other hand, I would say to those who say, well, therefore the SDGs have failed, yes, we also didn't plan with a pandemic, we didn't plan with a war in Ukraine, we didn't plan with an economic crisis that we are now facing. Don't focus initially so much on the targets and indicators, but rather on the veracity and the validity and the relevance of the goals. Because what they are in essence, they are turning the great global risks to our collective well-being into shared objectives. In a world so divided and so conflict-ridden right now, the SDGs in terms of their goals are actually extremely precious. It's just about the only agenda we have as nations of the world that we have all signed up to. Now, some might say, this is just prose and it is just dreaming about the future. I would say to you, take a look at how much the SDGs have become part of the national fabric of thinking about development, addressing inequality, realizing that leaving too many people behind threatens political and economic stability, but also the transitions that are envisaged in the SDGs. And here UNDP again is an institution that in my mind was in fact designed for the age of the SDGs, because access to energy, SDG 7, fundamental to development. Without electricity, without access to energy, development simply does not move forward. You can today design in UNDP a project that expands access to clean energy under SDG 7, and almost the same project could also be put under SDG 13. Tackling climate change is inextricably linked to access to clean energy. It reduces poverty. It requires finance. That is the complexity of designing development interventions in today's world. And therefore, I'm, in a sense, an unapologetic advocate of the SDGs, not because I think they are, in a sense, a simple solution to our problems, but because they finally lead us to a point where we take the integrated approach and the interdependent approaches as being fundamental to development futures. Future Smart UNDP, that is our hashtag in our current strategic plan, is very much focused on helping developing countries to ready themselves for the future while managing current crises. That in itself is an extraordinarily challenging objective against which we are judged, and we are investing our own resources. But I think it is the only way forward if we don't want to end up in a world that is defined by divergence. Let's be very clear. The 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were an age of convergence. We saw developing countries, wealthier nations, poorer nations, on a pathway of convergence. We are now in the midst of an era where if we don't act deliberately, commensurately in terms of scale and fast, we are actually going to enter into an age of divergence again. And that's measured in economic metrics, but ultimately the cost arises in political and social and environmental metrics.
So you've touched on an issue about UNDP's own capacity to manage these challenges and its function. We've got several questions in the chat, including from people who worked within UNDP in various capacities, about the question about whether UNDP has the flexibility, the agility, the resources, the scope, and the clout within the UN system to play the kind of leadership role that you've just described.
It's a fair question. I always begin by saying, when you have an organization with 22,000 staff, when you have essentially a portfolio of $4.5 to $5 billion, which is a very significant amount of finance available, but it is then split into 3.5 to 4,000 individual projects because of the nature in which we are financed, then clearly you are dealing with a large institution. Some would call it a bureaucracy. And I would even say bureaucracies are not only negative things. Part of the reason why we are an institution that has so much confidence and trust in those who provide us with financing and the funding is that we are able to provide transparency, accountability, despite failures. And let me also be clear, I deal with them regularly. But when you look at that portfolio, two things are, in a sense, very interesting. One, in the midst of the crisis that we went through, the pandemic, UNDP was at the forefront together with our UN sister agencies in the UN development system. First of all, to retain our ability to be present and to be right next to our developing country partners. Not a single office closed. Our staff worked in some of the most extreme situations in order to help countries cope with the COVID-19 crisis. In a matter of 5 months, social and economic response plans were developed for 130 countries. UNDP has that capacity because it is one of the largest entities and has this extraordinary presence on the ground in developing countries, 170 of them with whom we work at any one time, to be in a sense, almost an integral part of the national development landscape. This is an important asset, and it is one that has generated high levels of trust in developing countries. You asked about agility. I have tested, in a sense, the boundaries of that, and I want to just give you 3 brief examples. When I arrived, one of the great frustrations of many UNDP staff was precisely being trapped in so many projects and processes and procedures that the innovation curve of the institution was suffering. We then launched a so-called Accelerator Lab program, which established in over 90 countries within 16 months, teams of 3 people whose only task within that UNDP country team was to essentially explore the innovations from within that country. That program has been considered a major success, including by business schools, MIT and others, in terms of introducing a very agile way of tapping into innovations that are emerging from within countries, which are really the front line of development innovation today. The second example is, following the pandemic, we were asked by UN Secretary-General to lead, together with others, a program of integrated national financing frameworks, essentially helping countries very quickly in this fiscal distress moment starting last year to do an assessment of all their financing and investment opportunities and possibilities, domestic capital, public, private, concessional finance. Over 85 countries have now invited us to help them undertake this. We were able to roll out that program in a matter of 6 months, and there are now 86 countries working on this. A last example. In the lead up to Glasgow, it became very clear that unless the NDCs, these national climate strategies, could actually live up to the test of introducing higher levels of ambition, became critical to keeping the Paris Agreement alive. UNDP established a climate promise. We offered 100 countries to support them directly in reviewing their NDCs and developing national sovereign climate response strategies. 120 countries invited us. In less than 18 months, we were a partner, I think probably without precedent, to well over 100 developing countries in assisting them in coming to Glasgow with increased levels of ambition on mitigation and adaptation. So the institution is capable, despite sometimes its bureaucratic and procedural means, to actually deliver remarkable, rapid and scalable solutions, or at least responses that empower developing countries to exercise their national sovereign right of determining development pathways forward. So in a nutshell, the answer is, yes, we are not a startup, we are not a business. But even businesses, when they grow larger, become very bureaucratic. And I think my vision, my hope for UNDP is, in the way that we have put many reforms, starting with our internal procedures, but also with the digital offer that we have developed, our accelerator labs, now the Sustainable Energy Hub, the Sustainable Finance Hub, we're actually demonstrating that this is the 21st century institution that can not only rise to the challenge, but actually do so with agility, professionalism, and impact. Now, some of this will obviously be judged in due course by evaluations and by history, but I have to say, I have been surprised by what is possible if you have a very deliberate focus and you have the support of the international community. And here, the equation may in fact still break down again, because what we're facing right now is, with donor fatigue and the cutbacks in ODA, massive decreases in core funding to the institution. So UNDP cannot only exist on 3,500 projects that are hung like, socks on a washing line. Core financing an institution like this is fundamental to its capacity to be innovative, to be agile, and to be able to respond to crisis, as we have also done in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, where the presence of the UN with a development perspective out of this crisis is, in fact, in my mind, the best promise of getting out of crisis again. But that is a whole other subject.
It's a big one. Let me come back. There have been a number of questions in the Q&A about finance, environment financing, climate financing, including issues about the role of the private sector. You have the Global Alliance that came out of Glasgow. You have questions about, what the financing mechanisms could be, both through the GF and others. Talk a little bit more about what you see are the different roles and contributions of these financing strategies.
Well, if you take the last 20 years, the story of climate finance is essentially one of missed opportunities. The amount of effort that we have to go to mobilize, a replenishment of the GF with 5 to 6 to 7 billion, or maybe a recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund. And we're still talking in single-digit figures here in billions. And just to remind you again, an IRA in the United States, $350 billion, Europe's Green Deal, $800 billion. And, the Chinas and Indias obviously being large enough as economies also to mobilize public and private capital themselves. The great tragedy of environmental or climate finance is that the majority of the developing countries are being asked to make a transition, a pivot in a matter of a decade that other countries have taken anywhere between 20 to 80 years to do. And therefore, the tale of finance on climate in terms of the wealthier countries being able to provide concessional finance, grant finance, but also encourage access to private capital at rates that are affordable, is a series of missed opportunities. And I think much of what we are able to do in UNDP is we cannot change the psyche of the wealthier nations. We can only show to them the extraordinary opportunities that exist and the imperative to find an answer to the financing issue, which is in many ways also led by the Secretary-General of the United Nations right now, who, since the pandemic and subsequent to it, has increasingly focused, including for the Summit of the Future next year, on this international financial architecture and the financial system that clearly is not geared towards addressing the financing needs and modalities of our time. And I just want to give you another example that I very much in the context of finance want to show as a positive example. Private sector and private capital clearly are going to be the fundamental drivers in terms of scaling up. No country, the wealthiest included, has the public resources to provide the capital to make, for instance, the energy transitions and investments that we need. But if I may go back for a moment to Uruguay. In UNDP, 3 years ago, we set up a sustainable finance hub precisely to help developing countries to better frame and prepare themselves for how to go to capital markets in order to leverage private finance for the SDGs. And out of that came the SDG impact standards and norms, but also SDG bond support that we provide. Just in the last 18, 19 months, UNDP has accompanied Mexico, Uruguay, Uzbekistan, the New Development Bank, in raising SDG bonds on the capital markets. And more than $11 billion have been raised through that. And Uruguay is a particularly interesting example because Uruguay, with its own leadership and the support of IDB and UNDP, developed a sustainability-linked performance bond, which is a fascinating instrument with which it raised $1.5 billion late last year in very nervous financial markets. It was oversubscribed, I think, to the tune of $4 billion as an SDG bond that has two criteria that will influence the interest rate that Uruguay pays. Taking forest cover and carbon emissions. If it overperforms, the interest rate goes down. If it underperforms, the interest rate goes up. These are the kind of innovative tools that allow developing countries to raise capital in the context of their national development strategy. In the case of Uruguay, very much centered on climate. So access to private capital becomes crucial. And the way that it can be de-risked, the way that it can be structured, plays an extremely important role. And again, Uruguay's finance ministry really is quite pioneering here because it did another assessment. The subsidies it currently pays for the import of diesel oil in order to make public transport viable or socially accessible, in its own calculations, exceeds the amount of money it would have to pay as a subsidy to get the private sector to replace the diesel-powered buses with EV-powered bus fleets. So it has now changed its policy as in fact providing the kind of subsidy to private bus operators to start replacing their fleet of buses for public transport with EV buses, because it actually costs the economy less to do that than to continue with fossil fuel-based subsidies. And as you can imagine, that calculation has become even more compelling in the current energy markets that we face. This is the kind of approach to leveraging private capital. And UNDP in many countries today is supporting governments in looking at how to raise private capital, while we're also very actively supporting the Secretary-General, working with the IMF and the World Bank through the SDG stimulus plan, of addressing precisely the conditions under which private capital can become a realistic asset rather than a prohibitively unaffordable and, in a sense, a pipe dream that one throws at developing countries and then expects them to somehow jump over the kinds of thresholds that simply are not possible. So I think private capital will play a critical role, but let's be very clear, particularly for least developed countries and also for middle-income countries that are maybe facing economic distress, we also need significant concessional finance and grant finance. Walking away from that opportunity to co-invest is an act of irresponsibility in this age that we live in.
Strong message. We have just a minute or two left, but there are a lot of our students who are out there listening to this, and I'd like to invite you to tell them why they should think about a career working in organizations like the UNDP and how you have found that and what they should see as an opportunity for them going forward.
Well, let me maybe take you back to the moment when I was first in an interview panel, and then I met Kofi Annan for the first time, and I sat in his office, and basically he asked me, so why wouldn't you work for the United Nations? Because originally I was at that time the Director General of IUCN, and I was in a fantastic position, and I had not initially considered myself to be a candidate to lead the United Nations Environment Program. And I must admit, at that moment, I said, well, clearly the work of UNDP is very important. He said, no, take a step back. Do you believe in the idea of the United Nations? Have you ever read the Charter? Do you remember the moment in time when the United Nations was founded on the ashes of the Second World War? And that narrative has never left me. So to all of your students, I would say, if you believe in the idea of multilateralism, not just as an act of faith or a wonderful dream, but if you actually recognize how important it is to, in the midst of this very disrupted world, to have a space and a place where every nation, first of all, has a voice. Secondly, where under the Charter of the United Nations, with all the imperfections of realpolitik, we actually make extraordinary things happen every day, whether it is under the humanitarian brief that we have. Well over 100 million people will eat this evening somewhere in the world because of our humanitarian colleagues, our peacekeepers, but also the thousands of development projects that so many people simply dismiss. Everybody focuses on the Security Council in its dysfunctionality, and yet most countries actually are not on the agenda of the Security Council. They are the daily partners to the UN family of development organizations. We are, in the sense, that connecting tissue, that fabric that allows a world to still see with a sense of hope something that lies in the future by working together than against one another. And this is an idea that I deeply believe is worth defending and all the imperfections that are there. And to many of your students, I would say, you may not want to begin your career in the UN. You certainly shouldn't spend your whole life in the UN, because then you will have missed extraordinary experiences outside the parameters, the framework, the constraints of a multilateral organization. My pathway began completely different. I began with a small local NGO in India as an apprentice. I then went into development cooperation. I worked in IUCN. It was only later in life that I finally came to the conclusion, no, I can contribute something to this idea that we need to keep alive. And, so many people right now say, oh, is multilateralism dead? Is the UN a spent force? I think it needs, yes, shocks in terms of evolving and reforming itself. But above all, it needs member states and the public to care about it. The UN of today is also a product of benign neglect for, I would say, the better part of 20 to 30 years. And yet, I give you this as one example, as I speak to you this morning, I've just come off a phone call where I give you an example of why sometimes extraordinary things also come in the midst of an organization that looks very bureaucratic. Off the coast of Yemen lies an oil tanker with the name FSO Safa. It has been de facto abandoned for years. It is on the verge of breaking apart. It has over 1 million barrels of oil on it. In the midst of a conflict zone, nothing has been possible to do over the last few years. The UN, led by the resident coordinator, but UNDP now being the lead entity in operationalizing a rescue operation, is now literally in a position with the support of the international community to obtain an alternative large vehicle crude carrier. This is a 330-meter long oil vessel that is literally just left the port in China today, where it has had maintenance and fixtures put on. It is sailing to the Red Sea in the midst of this very tense conflict situation in order to pump the oil of the FSO Safa and prevent one of the greatest environmental disasters in human history from happening if that tanker were to break apart. All of that is also part of multilateralism at work. So to those of you who are thinking about the UN in terms of your own futures, whether for a while at the beginning of your career or whether later in your life, if you believe in the idea, then it's worth testing out what your contribution could be to it. And you might still walk away from it and say, it's not my place, perfectly legitimate. But I would bet that most of you would actually conclude that you can do extraordinary things with the banner of the United Nations behind you.
Can't think of a better way to end this extraordinary talk. It's been far-ranging, rich in detail, and admirable in your commitment and passion, which is something that we all very much admire and believe in. So thank you for taking the time. As we talked about before, I want all of our audience to know that SAIS and the UNDP have entered into a new partnership to work together on issues in the future, which we're very excited about. And I'm looking forward to inviting Administrator Steiner to join us in our new home next fall when we move to 555 and continuing this great partnership. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Dean Steinberg. It's not only a great pleasure, but an honor to be with you. And happy moves is all I can say, and see you in your new home.
Great. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.